There's a specific kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with work or sleep. It's the tiredness that shows up after spending an hour with someone you're supposed to love, a parent, an old friend, a sibling, and walking away feeling smaller than when you arrived. Not hurt in any dramatic, nameable way. Just diminished, quietly, in a way you can't quite explain to anyone else because on paper nothing happened. If that feeling sounds familiar, this video is for you. Over the next 23 minutes, I'm going to walk through 9 specific signs that a relationship, even one with deep history, even one wrapped in the language of family or old friendship, has become something worth stepping back from. Number 5 is the one almost nobody wants to admit applies to them, because it doesn't involve anyone doing anything wrong. Stay to the end, because that one alone might explain a distance in your life you've never fully understood until now. None of what follows is permission to cut people off carelessly or a case against loyalty. It's the opposite, a way of protecting the relationships that actually deserve your loyalty by getting honest about the ones that have been quietly draining you instead. Marcus Aurelius wrote himself a note that holds up as well now as it did then. Your power sits entirely in your own mind, not in outside events. And nowhere does that principle matter more than in deciding who gets ongoing access to it. 1. People who never have money, except for themselves. There's a specific pattern worth naming precisely because it's so easy to excuse the first few times it happens. Someone who greets every plan, every shared expense, every request for even minor support with the same reflexive line about not having the money, and who, somehow, always finds the money for the things that matter to them personally. I watched this play out with a friend for the better part of 2 years. Every trip we planned came with an apologetic message about being tight that month. Every group gift, every dinner split evenly, produced the same story. And yet his social feed told a completely different story. Trips, gadgets, nights out with other people, none of it hidden, none of it inconsistent with someone genuinely struggling. The gap wasn't subtle once I actually let myself see it. It took him backing out of a trip we'd planned together for over a year. A trip he'd been fully committed to right up until it required actually spending money on me specifically, for the pattern to finally register as a pattern rather than a string of unfortunate coincidences. What that moment actually revealed had nothing to do with his finances. It was a fairly precise measure of where I ranked on his list of priorities, and the ranking wasn't close to where our history would have suggested. Money, in relationships like this, rarely functions as a genuine constraint. It functions as a convenient, hard-to-argue-with excuse, one that lets someone avoid an uncomfortable conversation about priorities by hiding behind a number instead. The useful reframe here is one worth sitting with. Reciprocity isn't really about whether the amounts match exactly. Nobody's tracking a precise ledger in a healthy relationship. It's about whether both people are actually showing up for each other in whatever form is available to them. Time, effort, presence, or yes, sometimes money, or whether one person has quietly become a resource the other draws on without ever really replenishing. 2. People who turn every disagreement into a war and drag you into it. Some people can't seem to let a minor disagreement stay minor. What should be a 2-minute difference of opinion about where to eat becomes, somehow, a referendum requiring everyone at the table to declare a side. I had a friend like this for years, someone who came across as easygoing right up until the moment any friction appeared, at which point he'd escalate almost instantly, and then look around the group for backup, specifically expecting me to publicly agree with him regardless of what I actually thought. During one particularly ordinary planning conversation about a group trip, a small disagreement turned into exactly that, him pulling me directly into the argument, demanding I back him up in front of everyone else, treating my neutrality as a kind of betrayal. What became clear afterward replaying the exchange, wasn't really about the trip at all. Constant escalation like that usually isn't a sign of conviction. It's closer to the opposite, an inability to tolerate disagreement without treating it as a threat that needs to be won immediately with reinforcements. People secure in their own position rarely need an audience to validate it in real time. There's a modern version of this that plays out constantly in group chats, worth naming specifically because it's become so normalized. Someone who turns a scheduling disagreement into a multi-message thread requiring everyone to weigh in, screenshots included, until the original, trivial question is buried under an argument about who's actually being unreasonable. The instinct to escalate small friction into a group referendum is rarely about the specific issue. It's a habit, and habits like that cost the people around them real peace, repeatedly, over things that were never worth the cost in the first place. 3. People who minimize what you're carrying. Every person is carrying something, some visible, most of it not. One of the more quietly painful experiences in any relationship is opening up about something genuinely difficult, only to watch the other person redirect the conversation back to their own, comparatively smaller concern, as though yours doesn't register as real. I confided in a longtime friend once about a stretch of my life that was genuinely hard, juggling a demanding job while helping care for an aging parent, running on very little sleep, barely holding things together. Instead of anything resembling empathy, he glossed over what I'd said within a sentence or two and pivoted immediately to his own complaints about work stress. It wasn't cruelty exactly. It was something closer to an inability to hold space for someone else's difficulty without immediately needing to redirect attention back to his own. That exchange didn't just disappoint me. It genuinely hurt, in a way that took a while to fully name, because what it revealed was a ceiling on how much this particular friendship could actually hold. Relationships only really function when both people can, at least some of the time, set their own concerns aside long enough to actually be present for someone else's, and the absence of that capacity doesn't announce itself dramatically. It shows up in small moments like that one, repeated often enough that eventually the pattern becomes impossible to unsee. Respect, in practice, is rarely a grand gesture. It's closer to a habit, a genuine thank you, a real apology when warranted, a willingness to actually sit with someone else's struggle instead of racing to reclaim the spotlight. Distance from someone who consistently can't offer that isn't cold. It's simply an accurate read of what the relationship is actually capable of providing. 4. People who won't let you believe differently than they do. Healthy relationships are built on appreciating difference, not eliminating it. Some people, though, treat any gap between their beliefs and yours, religious, political, or otherwise, as a problem requiring correction, and they won't rest until you've either agreed or exhausted yourself defending your own position. I had an old friend who fell squarely into this category. Every conversation eventually circled back to the same underlying message. His way of seeing the world was correct, and mine needed adjusting. For a while I engaged, defending my own view point by point, and every single time I walked away emotionally drained rather than persuaded or persuasive. Eventually, it became obvious that the arguments weren't leading anywhere productive. They were simply pushing us further apart, one exhausting conversation at a time. There's a specific trap worth naming here, because it explains why these exchanges rarely end well for either side. Once both people are defending their ego rather than actually exchanging ideas, the conversation stops being a conversation. It becomes a contest neither side can really win. Even a victory tends to come at the cost of the other person's goodwill, and that cost usually outlasts whatever satisfaction the win produced. The people who navigate disagreement best aren't the ones who argue hardest. They're the ones who know when a conversation has stopped being productive and are willing to step back from it without needing to have the last word. Letting go of the compulsion to always be right isn't a loss. It's frequently the only path back to something that actually resembles peace, a kind of peace that winning the argument was never going to provide in the first place, no matter how airtight the argument was. If you've made it this far, drop the word peacefulness in the comments. It helps me know who's actually sticking with this one. 5. Friends you've simply grown apart from. This is the sign that's hardest to name, because it doesn't involve betrayal, cruelty, or any clear wrongdoing on either side. It's the quiet realization that someone who once brought you real joy now feels, without any obvious reason, a little distant. A colleague once told me about a childhood friend he'd shared everything with growing up: movies, sports, long conversations about the future neither of them could have accurately predicted. Life eventually pulled them in different directions. One built a career and a family in a new city. The other stayed close to home, building a quieter, different kind of life. The rare times they reconnected, something had shifted. Conversations that used to flow now felt effortful, filled with polite catch-up questions standing in for the ease that used to be automatic. He told me he tried, for a while, to force the friendship back to what it had been. What he eventually realized was that trying harder wasn't closing the gap, it was just making the gap more obvious. Choosing to step back wasn't a rejection of what the friendship had meant. It was an acknowledgement that the version of the friendship that had worked no longer matched who either of them had become. This is worth naming plainly, because it's one of the few signs on this list that doesn't require blaming anyone. Relationships, like people, are not static. Interests shift, values evolve. Life takes people down genuinely different paths, and none of that is anyone's fault. Sometimes the healthiest move isn't confrontation or repair. It's simply accepting that the rhythm has changed and letting the relationship settle into whatever smaller, more honest shape actually fits now, rather than forcing it to perform a closeness that's no longer really there. 6. People who use you as an emotional dumping ground. There's a meaningful difference between someone sharing a hard moment with you and someone treating you as a permanent receptacle for whatever they're carrying, with no interest in what you might be carrying yourself. I had a former colleague, I'll call her Sarah, who I was genuinely close to for a while. During a period when my mother was critically ill and I was barely holding my own schedule together, I badly needed support. Sarah, instead, showed up daily with an ongoing stream of complaints about her job, her boss, her husband, never once asking how I was actually doing. When I tried, a few times, to redirect the conversation toward what I was going through, she'd steer it back to her own grievances within a sentence or two. Every interaction left me more drained than before it started, and worse, quietly guilty for not having the capacity to fully show up for her complaints on top of everything else. The moment that finally clarified things for me was almost absurd in its smallness. Right after my mother's surgery, Sarah called to complain that I hadn't replied to her messages fast enough. That was when I finally said, plainly, that I couldn't keep doing this, that I had too much on my plate and needed the people around me to understand that. Her response was a long silence, and the friendship quietly faded after that. It was uncomfortable. It was also, unmistakably, the right call. Not every difficulty someone shares with you needs to become yours to carry. And being a good friend doesn't obligate you to function as someone's unconditional emotional dumping ground, especially when the exchange only ever runs in one direction. Listening well means actually hearing someone, but it doesn't mean absorbing an unlimited stream of complaints from someone who's never once checked whether you had the capacity to hold it or the interest in reciprocating when you needed the same. 7. People who treat their promises as optional. A broken promise, on its own, isn't necessarily a red flag. Everyone occasionally has to cancel or fall short. The pattern worth paying attention to is someone who breaks promises reliably enough that you've started expecting it, and who seems to have genuinely forgotten they made a commitment at all by the time it comes due. I remember sitting alone in a coffee shop, waiting for a friend I'd made specific plans with. An hour in, with no word, I finally got a message. Totally forgot we had plans today, sorry. It wasn't the first time. What made it land differently that particular day was recognizing, finally, that continuing to accept this pattern wasn't protecting the friendship. It was just quietly costing me, over and over, while she seemingly paid nothing. There's a specific kind of quiet damage in this pattern worth naming directly. It's not really about the missed coffee. It's the accumulated message underneath repeated broken commitments, that you're consistently not important enough to plan around carefully, even by someone who would likely deny that if you said it to their face. A promise is a small act of respect, and someone who treats theirs as consistently optional is, whether they intend it or not, communicating something real about where you sit on their list. Choosing to step back from a relationship like that isn't about punishing the other person. It's about respecting yourself enough to stop absorbing a message you don't actually believe is true, delivered to you repeatedly by someone's actions rather than their words. 8. People who keep bringing the same problem back without ever trying to fix it. There's an important difference between someone processing a difficulty out loud, which is healthy and human, and someone who returns to the exact same complaint, conversation after conversation, while quietly rejecting every piece of actual advice offered, because what they actually wanted wasn't a solution. It was validation on repeat, indefinitely. I had a former colleague who came to me constantly about work frustrations. Early on, I took the complaints seriously enough to offer real, specific suggestions, things she could actually try. Every time, she'd nod along, and then bring the exact same complaint back the following week, unchanged, as though the previous conversation had never happened. Eventually, it became clear that she wasn't actually interested in changing her situation. She wanted a witness to her frustration, repeated indefinitely, with no intention of acting on anything discussed. Eventually, I told her, honestly, that I valued the relationship, but that going in circles on the same issue wasn't helping either of us, that I was glad to help if she genuinely wanted to change something, but that the effort had to start on her end. She didn't take it well in the moment. It was still the right thing to say. Real friendships sometimes requires the harder version of kindness, honesty, even when it's unwelcome, rather than the easier version, which is just endless, comfortable sympathy that quietly keeps both people stuck exactly where they started. Listening without ever contributing to actual movement drains both sides eventually, even if only one of them notices it happening. 9. People who only talk about who they used to be. There's a specific kind of person whose conversation always circles back to past achievements, the award, the title, the accomplishment from years or even decades ago, recounted in detail, again, as though it were the single most important thing about them, while their actual present life stays carefully off limits. I knew someone like this for a while, a man who could describe, in vivid detail, a professional honor he'd received years earlier, but who deflected almost every question about his current life with something vague and dismissive. What became apparent over time wasn't confidence. It was the opposite, someone anchored so firmly to a past high point that he'd never quite figured out how to build anything comparable in his present, and the constant recounting was less a celebration than a substitute for something missing now. The sad part, watching this from the outside, was how the effect on other people ran in the opposite direction from what he probably intended. Rather than inspiring admiration, the repetition slowly pushed people away, because listening to someone perform their old glories, over and over, eventually starts to feel less like connection and more like an obligation. A person genuinely secure in their present life rarely needs to keep reaching backward to prove their worth. Their current life does that work on its own, quietly, without narration. Run back through all 9, and none of them are really about the other person being a bad person in some sweeping, permanent sense. Most of these patterns come from somewhere. Insecurity, unprocessed pain, habits nobody ever challenged them on. Understanding that doesn't obligate you to keep absorbing the cost of it. Setting distance from a relationship that's consistently draining you isn't a betrayal of loyalty or love. It's the same principle Marcus Aurelius kept returning to. You don't control what other people do, but you fully control what you continue to allow into your own life. Protect your peace deliberately. The relationships that actually deserve you will still be standing once you do.